So welcome to this session of the Qualitative Methods Masterclass webinar series. I'm Neringa Kalpokas, Director of ATLAS.ti, and I'm very pleased to introduce to this series of webinars that are organized by the University of British Columbia, Copenhagen, and sponsored by ATLAS.ti, Software for Qualitative Data Analysis. The objective of this webinar series is to offer insights into innovative approaches and practices in qualitative data analysis with the ATLAS.ti and qualitative methods in general. We strongly believe that this initiative of sponsorship can bring and reach people all around the world, democratize knowledge, and help researchers by providing these sessions totally for free. I want to express my gratitude to Professor Emerita Carina Olson, who came to us several years ago with a brilliant idea to launch this project. So without further ado, I would like to ask or to pass the floor to the leader of the International Qualitative Research Toolkit, Professor Olson.
Thank you very much. My name is Karin Olson. I'm at the International Qualitative Research Toolkit at University of British Columbia, Okanagan campus. I would like to begin by respectfully acknowledging the Syilx Okanagan Nation and their people in whose traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory UBC Okanagan is situated. I would also like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of your lands. It is my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Moerman. Dr. Gerben Moerman is a Dutch sociologist, lecturer, and researcher. He is a director of the BSc and MSc programs in sociology at the University of Amsterdam. Gerben's research focuses on qualitative methods, such as interview dynamics and practices of qualitative analysis, including participatory interpretation. He has been using ATLAS.ti for decades, and he loves teaching qualitative as well as mixed methods. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Moerman.
Thank you very much, Karen, for this very nice introduction. And thank you very much, Neringa, also for setting this up and sponsoring this. I'm honored that I'm allowed to talk here, and for quite a crowd that unfortunately we cannot see properly. So I'll try to talk to you directly, but yeah, I'm really sad that we can't actually interact so much. Thanks for the International Qualitative Research Toolkit for organizing this. And as I said, I'm honored to be teaching here a bit. I'm going to share my screen, and then usually some of the screens jump around, so bear with me if you see something moving. Yeah, some things are moving, and I have to increase this for a bit, and I hope you can still see me, and I can still see some of you. Is everything visible?
Yes, all is good.
Excellent. What you're looking at is a picture I made some years ago when traveling with my father in India. This is Ahmedabad, and this is the Tree of Life in the Sidi Said Mosque. And this Tree of Life is also a symbol of the city of Ahmedabad, and it's famous for its intricacies, and it's famous for its labyrinth. And in thinking, what theme can I give to this talk on collaborative and qualitative analysis and interpretation? I thought, well, I'm going to try to tell people a lot. Maybe it's too much, so maybe people get lost in all the intricacies, like this Tree of Life, like this labyrinth. So actually, it's kind of a reminder to keep you to the stem and some of the branches, rather than to delve into all the little leaves and so on. And I just liked it as an image because it also questions what is behind this. That's at least what I think about this. So again, thank you for having me. I'm going to talk on why the hell should we collaborate in analysis. And straight away, I'm giving you the answer. The first answer is we have to think, or many of us have to be able to think with bigger data. So I'm going to say a few things on that, and I'm going to use one way of dealing with that, and that was in a rather conventional content analysis. And I'm going to use my PhD thesis research as an example. So theory-driven, researcher-led content analysis, qualitative content analysis. The second answer is thinking with bigger questions. So trying to pose more complex questions. And actually, I had two examples for this. But when preparing, I simply thought it's way too much. So unfortunately, I cut away one of the examples, and that's the Safati research. And they kind of overlap in their goals, so it's a possibility. But I'll talk about collaborative ethnographic work in which the research is done by not just a single researcher designing everything, but by a group of researchers working collaboratively. And if you've ever worked collaboratively with an ethnographer, you know how difficult that is, because they're all very stubborn people thinking their own way is the best way. And also lovely colleagues, of course. The third answer is, can we actually think with bigger crowds? And this is something that is more in development stage still. And I would love to talk a bit about, or give some ideas on, collaborative interpretation. And I'll try to talk you through all this. So to start with, why should we collaborate? Well, I think it's to think with bigger data. And I'm emphasizing thinking here because we see a lot of new work popping up of people working with bigger data, non-sociologists, people like Alex Pentland, who come from physics and start using the word social physics that in sociology we haven't used since the 19th century anymore. As for its classical ideas. And these computer scientists and physicists have jumped on board and did very nice research based on algorithms that really revolutionized parts of social science. However, and here's the caveat you all were waiting for, there's very often a clear lack of theory. There's also sometimes a lack of solid interpretation, and in public life we've seen algorithms that worked fantastically but very unethically, algorithms that were based on all kinds of interpretations of the social world out there. In the Netherlands there were examples of very racist profiling of algorithms that were used by the government. Things go wrong if we start simply applying these algorithms without thinking. So currently more and more sociologists have started to think along, or sometimes think against these algorithms. And I think it's really important to do. And we also see it among the new digital humanities people. And I don't know how to categorize them, so I just call them, but people working with from the digital humanities. So the main point I want to stress about big data or big textual data is what people do is actually using some kind of classic quantitative content analysis, but using automation as much as possible, which is in many places perfectly feasible. PhD students call me for teaching them sentiment analysis, stuff like that, using word list, lexicons, semantic analysis, or all kinds of algorithm-based issues, and we can actually use them. And they're part of many of the software packages now. They're part of also Python and R when people program a bit more, but then obviously they're more flexible. But they lead to the same kind of problems of validity and meaning as the larger scale quantitative content analysis lead to. And as my PhD supervisor used to call it, if you put garbage in, it's garbage out. So it looks like a golden bucket, but it can also easily produce nonsense. As we probably all know, it's very easy to produce nonsense using sentiment analysis. And it's one of the things I make my students do. So they have to do a sentiment analysis on their own assignments. And gosh, they're really negative. Although obviously they're not negative, it's an assignment, it's not something for a sentiment analysis. So what should we do? What do we need? We need meaning and theory, I would say. We need to think along. So we need to think about smarter ways of doing textual analysis, as the authors here suggest. And there's some great examples of people doing that, to mention Franzosi for one. Or smart content analysis, as Sikoro already told us almost 50 years ago. We also need meaning and theory in the analyst, and as we just heard from Karen in the talk before we started, Bonnie Glaser passed away, but one of his books on theoretical sensitivity is an example of using meaning generation, analytical imagination, as was also written about by James, this author. So we need to think and bring in our books ourselves. But also we need to talk among each other. So we need to discuss as researchers how we use different perspectives, use different views, use some constructivism even in very realist research. We need to use different ways of looking at the world. And when you look at my role as a program director at the University of Amsterdam, my students look at me in a certain way. So if they have to describe me, they describe me in a certain way. My colleagues, who we've been I was almost trying to say abuse, but at least we make them work really, really, really hard in sometimes dire situations, especially during this COVID. They look at me from a more Foucauldian way. Obviously, I'm there to pressurize and bring in the system. That's not how the students view my role. It's not how some other colleagues view their role. Is anyone wrong? No, probably not, but we all have different perspectives from different positions, or positionality plays a role here. And probably these different interpretations are good interpretations. And if we talk to each other, we can learn from these interpretations. So the first example, we need theory. If you do a content analysis in a classical way, as I did during my PhD thesis, I think we need theory a lot. And we also need to collaborate around theory. So my PhD thesis was on interviewing, as was already said by Karen. I look at dynamics of interviewing, and the topic was on social categorization. So what is an Amsterdammer, what is a friend, and what is an allochtoon, which is a word we are not using anymore in the Netherlands because it became quite a derogatory term, but it's a term used for people who themselves or their parents or their grandparents or their great-grandparents migrated. in these interviews, it was about social categorization. And in total, we did 214 qualitative interviews, leading to lots and lots of hours of interviews, simply too much bigger data to analyze just on my own, just coding on my own, just analyzing it on my own. There was a very detailed transcription because it was about interviewer turns and interviewer interaction. So in total, there were more than 50,000 interviewer turns and more than 50,000 respondent turns. And quite some of you are probably well aware of ATLAS.ti. This led to 106,000 quotations, which really stressed the software out back then. I worked with 9 coders in order to analyze this. And the research was on probing tactics, on different ways of probing during an interview. So a more accommodating way. Could you tell me more about this? Or a more encouraging, oh, wow, that's interesting. Can you tell me more about this? Or a more challenging way, I don't really get it. First you said this and now you say that. First you categorize friends this way and now you talk about this person not as a friend anymore. Can you explain? So that's a challenging way. And I looked at the effect of those tactics on both the quality and the content. Did people talk differently about their friends? Did people turn into racist when they were questioned critically, challengingly, or not? Did people change the amount of information? So I also looked at the quality of information. So this was an experiment, and I worked with 12 interviewers in each tactics, and they all tried to do 72 interviews, 71 in these cases, because they didn't complete it fully. Now, for the coding process, I had this large pile of transcripts. So we worked with transcripts and people transcribed, I transcribed and people transcribed for me. And the first thing I did was theming the data, as you would do in most projects, and I do in most projects. And then I trained the coders, and these coders were trained not just in how to apply the codes technically, I trained them in the idea of my research, so theoretically, to try to make them understand what I was asking them from, not just training, okay, put this code on that and don't think. No, I hired them as smart people and not as computers. So I want them to think along with the research goals, but I also trained them, oh, sorry, I was too quick. I also trained them in theory. And only then I trained them in how to code and what to code. Then we did test interviews, and they received parts of the main project, and we had an intricate system of backing up, which was never necessary, but and all kinds of regular checks. And in the end, we merged the projects again. I'll tell you more about that. Now, what did they code on? They coded on 3 aspects, and I'm not going to talk about the first 2. The first one I did, the administrative coding. This part of the interview is on friendship. This part is on Amsterdammers. The interviewer behavior codes were on what does the interviewer do, posing a question or probing in a certain way. But the third part was the most interesting part, was the part on quality and content. And in order to teach them how to code, I trained them in my goals, obviously, of this research. So I told them what I need to find is something on quality and on the content of what's going on in the interviews. And in order to train them to look for the amount of information, I trained them in an ethnomethodological theory of Harvey Sachs. And that ethnomethodological theory was membership categorization analysis. And it goes way beyond our goals for today to talk about this. especially if you start trying to read this, and I won't read it for you, but if you try to read it while I'm talking, you cannot understand either me or the text here. But this is a theory on how people categorize in talk. And we applied this to the interviews. How do people categorize? And because this was on social categorization, and this membership categorization by Harvey Sachs is a very interesting theory with which you can look at the ways people categorize, so the collections of categories, but also on how they apply it. Because very often people apply categories without using specific names and without using specific labeling. And I had to make my coders aware of this. And they used it in order to think with the data and not just code as if they were robots. So how did this translate? Well, they had to code on the categories, on the predicates, even when the predicates and the categories were not literally mentioned, but referred to. And people very often refer to categories in vague terms, especially when it's a bit more controversial. You know, they. Who are they? Well, it was very often very clear from the interview who they were talking about, but you need to have a theoretical lens for that. So this was how I translated these more membership categories towards these indicators that I needed for my experiment on these interviews. So 9 coders, one researcher, that was me, and this is what we did a lot. These Krippendorf's alphas, the classical content analysis on the practice interview, after the training, halfway, and at the end of the coding. And in ATLAS.ti, this was what we did. And this is kind of the standard, and it's even in the manual of ATLAS.ti, so I go through it quickly. What you do, the classic way in collaborative work, is you clone the main project. So you appoint a data manager, in this case was me. You use one main project, and then you export the project at a certain date, obviously, and you name it in a proper way. You clone the project into different parts. So for my PhD thesis, all coders received a part of the data. They didn't receive everything, but just the part they had to code. And I cloned it within ATLAS.ti, then exported it and sent it to the different coders. They coded it, sent it back to me, and after sending it back, I merged it again into the main file in order to do all my analysis, plus in order to export it again. And this is the common way people use when working technically. And I promised Niringa to say a few words about the technical bit. But it wasn't just that. But just doing that probably made Klaus Krippendorf very happy. But I also broke many rules of Klaus Krippendorf, because I took the code as serious as human beings, as trained anthropologists, sociologists, and they were all trained anthropologists and sociologists. So we talked, we discussed, how do you code this? Why do you code it this way? And this is something that goes against some of the rules that we see in content analysis. But I did it because I felt that this would improve our coding in general sense. Yes, and it's cheating with regards to reliability, but it's cheating for a very good cause, because the validity improved. So here there's some things on collaboration already seeping in. Again, this question on why collaboration. In the short outline, I referred to this to this text. We're all in this pandemic. We're all with these vaccines, and the success of vaccines have been tremendous. And part of it was because hundreds of scientists had worked on mRNA vaccines for decades before the coronavirus pandemic brought a breakthrough. People have been collaborating on this. Science has been working like this for years now. People work in teams in science more and more and more. And why is that? Not because we have a lot of data, okay, but also because the questions we try to solve have become really complex. And we're dealing with complex questions. That's one of the things they address also in this paper. So we need to think with bigger questions. So the second example. The second example is on co-create. And as the name says, it's a co-creative project. It's a project we do in 5 countries, funded by the European Union, as you see. And it's on confronting obesity among youth. And it tries to engage youth and in coming up with policy ideas against obesity. And one of the core elements is to make also the youth aware that obesity is not just something individual, and we individualize it very often, but it's a systemic issue because of class, or because of all kinds of other situations where people simply only have access to certain types of food. So this is a huge project, and what these youth did was, in youth alliances, as they were called, youth participatory action research. They were working collaboratively, using group building, using system mapping, how the social world could look like, using different methods here. They tried to come up with new policies, suggest policies to people that are usually talking just about them and not with them. So that's what we try to do in more than 20 groups throughout Europe. And one of the examples was a group in the Netherlands that discussed the school canteen food in the Netherlands. People usually bring their food with them, bread and cheese. It's the common norm. However, there are also school canteens where you can buy some food, but usually it's fast food. It's unhealthy food. So these kids suggested new policies, and they also said, wait a second, it's only very classical Dutch food. For some people, either because of religious food rules or because of other reasons, do not fit with their diet. So let's come up with a more diverse canteen. So these school kids said, we are going to cook in school. And they did it as a project and rolled it out as a suggestion for policy, and gained enormous self-confidence. That was a side effect, which was really good because it was a very successful project. Now, in the analytical process of doing this throughout Europe, we had to have all kinds of people collaborating on this project. Our goal was to research how can we make these huge projects, youth projects, a success. And if you want to study success, if you want to study what the outcomes are, you have to look at the process, especially if you want to do this qualitatively. These were small groups, and we had to look at them in their meetings, in their sessions in these alliances. So what we did was we worked with facilitators and co-facilitators, people in Poland, people in Norway, people in Portugal, people in the Netherlands, in the UK, collaborating and working with these young kids and trying to train them in interviewing, trying to train them in thinking about policy. But these these facilitators were from all walks of life. They weren't all ethnographers, so we couldn't simply ask them to use their ethnography skills. So what we did was we created many protocols in order to have a kind of standardized way of documentation. We gave them fieldwork training, so we trained them in observation. We did some field note writing and collaboratively. We did some analysis. I even trained them a little bit in ATLAS.ti. But we did this in order to train people to think more qualitatively, because there were psychologists and dietitians and all walks of life. As soon as they wrote their minutes, they wrote their field notes, they sent it in to the Amsterdam team that reviewed all the documentation. So each and every time they wrote field notes, they were reviewed by some of my colleagues who did excellent work. And we were pretty strict in data management. Obviously, it was a huge project, and otherwise the data would have been a mess. And I used a very smart trick that I'm happy to share with you, because as soon as focus group coding came out, we could directly use it in this project, because we use focus group coding, although it was not on focus group, but it was on our pretty structured protocols for documentation. It was for theming the data, and I will show you how. Obviously, we did some code retrieval, and then we did in-country descriptions. So per country, one of the main team persons from Amsterdam wrote, or the main analysis team wrote these descriptions based on our analysis, but also based on the hours of interaction with the facilitators in the different countries and all the reviews they did before of the documentation. These were again then shared with the countries. Sorry, we have new neighbors that start to to rebuild the house. I'm sorry if there's a noise. But the people from Poland and Portugal reread the reports we'd written from Amsterdam. Then we did other code retrievals in order to do the between country descriptions, so to compare the different countries. And we're currently in that process of very inspiring team writing. I have to do a lot still. It leads to mountains of secondary data, because it's descriptions of process by newly trained facilitators and co-facilitators. They were all in English. They wrote logs, field notes, alliance proposals, and the youth themselves wrote some feedback. And then, as I said, they were all reviewed by the Amsterdam team of trained ethnographers. Now, I was bragging, and not even humbly, I was bragging about the focus group coding. And what we did was, in order to train people how to write field notes, we structured the field notes a bit. So we structured them with some more demographic information or kind of background information, but also with the themes that came across during these alliance meetings. So the ethical questions, different reflections, how the youth talked about obesity, whether they shifted from individual explanations to more systemic explanations, what they talked about with regards to stigmatization, and so on and so forth. Group dynamics, was this a success or not? And we used focus group coding. What I did was simply send out Word documents to everyone, because everyone knows how to type in Word. And in the margin, there was this prefix there. So @fn1, which was the first code. And here you see @fn16 on demographics. Here you see fn17 on what are the activities that the groups did. This was more content analysis theming the data, but saved us a tremendous amount of work. And because I promised to show something in ATLAS.ti, I'm going to show something in ATLAS.ti But the nice thing is I recorded it, so no messy things in Atlas. It's all going to work, hopefully. So this is my recording of yesterday. I hope it works. Yes, there goes my my mouse. I'm scrolling through the example, of course, because I'm not showing any real data here. These are the field notes with the different codes. I'm going to click on the focus group coding, the new trick in ATLAS.ti for 2 years now. And they usually are called Peter, but here they're called FN18. And it's just this document that we code. And here automatically the codes are generated. And within a few seconds, many documents were automatically themed. Now, this is not very useful, just call them FN16. So we obviously renamed them to the proper names, demographics and diversity and so on. And if I was smarter beforehand, I would have done something else that I did with later codes. I wasn't, but so we had an extra step to take, but it became really useful. But that wasn't all, because these facilitators, co-facilitators, they really knew these groups. They really knew what was going on. They knew our blind spots with regards to the forms we had in our field notes forms. So we asked them to give us hashtags like it was Twitter. And everyone understood this and everyone did this. So we asked them to give up hashtag. And some of these hashtags were suggested by some of the Dutch, others were by the Portuguese, others were by the Polish or the UK, all over. And this was more bottom-up coding. And again, automatically, I coded all these hashtags, which wasn't a lot of work, was auto-coded within the Word documents. And here you see one of the examples. Now, both have advantages. Yeah, the hashtags was themes, like I saw it in the chat. I'm sorry, I shouldn't read the chat because it distracts me. Obviously, there are advantages and disadvantages. The advantages I bragged about, so I'm not going to say much about this. Reducing ethnographic field notes, I think Karen would kind of look puzzled. To forms is terrible thing. I know. It was, we felt heartbroken about this. So we lose many context issues. We lose serendipity. We have rather broad themes there. But that's why we did the collaboration. So we catch up for this with the collaboration. It clearly showed that coding wasn't all. The other disadvantages, the disadvantages of the text were comparability, because they popped up in Poland and they popped up in Portugal. But did we mean the same thing here? Probably not always. And also, when you start retrieving this, from, hey, this is something that is also on ethics, but it is in the part on the activities. They say we can't do this activity because it's unethical, and it's not in the ethical part of the field notes. This can mean that it's kind of detached from its context, a classical critique on coding, actually. And to address this classical critique on coding, I would dare to say that coding is useful, but it doesn't answer all the research questions. And I think we quite often overfocus on coding, also in software, or maybe especially in software, but also in grounded theory, we overfocus on coding. And very often coding is not very conscious as a process. Now, in this case, it is a very unconscious process because it was designed that way. It's automated. But in my PhD thesis, I know that the coders sometimes just did the labor rather than much of the thinking. And the question is also whether it leads to serendipity. And there's a lovely example of serendipity in crowdsourced coding, but I'm going to skip that. What did we learn most from? Well, the codes were useful to open the data. The codes were useful to organize the data. The codes were useful in trying to answer the research question. Hey, we want to write the text on the ethics. Hey, we want to write the text on, did the youth come up with policy ideas? And that was really nice that we had the codes there, because we had all the fragments that were coded on that. We had all the alliance proposals there that were automatically coded. And these are my symbols for my gestures for quotation. These were the quoted elements. So, and even some new questions that popped up on ethics, for instance, the codes were really useful. So unprepared questions beforehand. Conversing with the facilitators, so having conversations was really useful. Reading all the stuff narratively and writing about it was extremely useful for the patterns, more useful than the codes. And discussing among us was really, really, really useful. So the actual cool stuff was in the collaboration. And that is why I wanted to do this talk, because this is what is, for me, really inspiring. The team-based research, sitting together with a team and thinking about what is going on here, talking with the people in Portugal, what is going on here, using the participatory methods like they did in the other side of Middletown, the restudy of the classical Middletown studies, in which they used participatory ethnography, where ethnography is not just going somewhere and grabbing information and saying thank you and leaving again. No, but going somewhere and collaboratively working on the interpretation of the information, where different skills of different people, different perspectives are actually brought in and used. So this is really cool to do, and this is what is rather old. We see it in the mass observation as was done in 1930s in the UK, where people in society were asked to do observations, and also we see it in citizen science. Now, can we think with bigger crowds? Yes, we can, because that's what platforms like Zooniverse are doing for citizen science. A lot. The only thing is, if you click on social science, you see history projects and not social science projects. So really find or something with a chimpanzee. I didn't look into what they did, but I assume it's not really social science. But this is all history project. Very nice project, but not really social science. So what we've been trying to do with Christian Breuer, my colleague, and all these others, was trying to come up with something with which we could do collaboration. And we call it panel because it's a participation panel. So it's not just for research, it's also just to get people talking among each other. And we were very inspired by these little data sessions that we had before COVID in our department, and sometimes we try to do them over Zoom. It's a bit harder, but we try to think, can we open this up and can we scale this up to a larger audience? And what we tried to do was we tried to develop a methodology to do this, where we would shift from coding towards interpretation and then comparing interpretations. So rather than assigning a code to something, and if you do this in ATLAS.ti, rather than assigning a code, you would write a memo about something and then compare what different authors, what different interpretivists, what different people have written about this. And rather than voting or saying, oh, this is the most popular one, as we would do in a larger content analysis, we would say, no, we are going to combine the ones that are similar. We're going to stack them onto each other. And we're discussing about this. And I plan to show you a bit about this, but I'm going to skip that because I think you grab the idea. We did many experiments with the software, and we learned that good formulation of questions is essential. If you pose bad questions, then again, it's like the algorithms. But if you ask people to interpret something, but you're not very clear on what you want them to interpret, it leads to problems. So it has some relation with classical surveys that if you put in bad questions, you end up with bad material. Garbage in, garbage out. Instruction is needed, and that's with design. And also a matter of design was that we allowed people to stack different interpretations onto each other, which was really cool to do because you could grab it and then stack it onto another one. But it led to sometimes what we called stupid stacking. People thinking, hey, this is fun. I can just put all the yellow, it's kind of the sticky notes, all the sticky notes onto each other. And look, now I have a pile of 20 sticky notes. But except that they're yellow, they don't have any similarities anymore. So it was probably way too cool. And it really depended on with who we were working with. If we were working with stakeholders at the municipality, it worked tremendously. What are the main problems you run into in your work? And then people wrote a text, and then other people interpreted these texts, and that was stacked. Now that worked fabulously because they had different positions, different stakeholders, and they could discuss among each other really nicely, and they could stack really nicely. Now these are the problems, and these are the problems, and not these are the problems. If we did it with students that were slightly less motivated, we ended up sometimes in stupid stacking. So the participation project in social domains worked really well. And we also learned that developing software is really a pain anywhere in the body. Developing software is a lot of work. So concluding, and sorry, I'm 2 minutes over my time, I see. Concluding, there are definitely very different forms of collaborative analysis. For me, and that's the message I try to convey today, it's all about interpretation, it's all about meaning making, it's all about theoretical sensitivity, thinking with or against theories. It's all about meaning making. If it's not about meaning making, computers are probably better at it than we are. And robots are probably better, and big data people can help us out in many ways. But as soon as we need to think about it, and we do need to think about also these algorithms, then there are different goals. If our goal is to work, to think with bigger data, we should share the intelligent work. That's one way of going about. So sharing the work and sharing the workload, because a lot of data means a lot of interpretation. And you see it in the citizen science project, but we need smart people to interpret this. We have to think, when we think with bigger questions of societal issues, like one of the other pandemics that we're in, that's the obesity pandemic, we need to think also with people, but also with different fields, different disciplines, and bring in different perspectives and make them think along. And especially when we think with bigger crowds, and that's the part I love mostly, and that's the participatory aspect, the ethnographic aspect of also doing your analysis in collaboration. And there's a world to win still on all the software sides. So see this as a knock on the door again with ATLAS.ti to improve on that beyond the cloud or in the cloud. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moerman. That was really fascinating. For those of you who are online, please start typing any questions you may have into the chat box. And while we're waiting for those to come, we have a question from someone about whether there is a link that they could use to follow up on the obesity project.
Oh yeah, of course. I will add it to the PDF.
Okay.
But if you go Google on co-create and obesity, you will find it
pop up.
It will pop
Great.
up.
We're still waiting here. Mostly people just said how much they loved it. And I think the practical applications of ATLAS.ti to some really big work is such a relief for people to see that there are ways to do this. We have one question about the challenges of training coders in the theoretical underpinnings. So it's one thing to teach the mechanisms, but getting people to understand the theoretical work is something else. And also about bringing in different perspectives, as you say, valuing different opinions, not straying from the research question, those kind of challenges.
Yeah. Yeah. I will try to answer the first question with regards to the theory. When training interviewers, because that's the field I grew up in as a PhD, when training interviewers, if you train interviewers how to behave following protocols, they become pretty bad interviewers. If you train interviewers in what they need, what questions they need to answer with the interviewers, with the interviews, they become much better interviewers. So that's kind of the approach I usually take when training coders as well. Because if people are fully aware of why they do something, and it's also in teaching, if students are aware of why reliability is sometimes tremendously important, it's way more effective. And even raising your children, why something is important, is way more effective than simply saying, no, you're not allowed to do that. Look before you cross the street. It's way more effective to simply show, look, that car is coming. And then I used some methodology, or used when they were small, as look them in the eye, because if they acknowledged you, then you can cross the street. So, and if you explain stuff, I think one is you democratize some of the work, and two is you make people way more aware of what they're doing and why they're doing it. And it's also much more fun for coders to see, wait a second, I'm not just here doing this because he couldn't or they couldn't find a computer or an algorithm smart enough to do this. I'm doing this because it is interesting. That's why Zooniverse is such a success, because people love reading old letters that people have sent across the globe, and then decipher these letters. And even there are even projects about taxes being paid, and people love that because it's what people have paid in taxes and how they paid it. And probably that's because you see the goal much more. Yes, it's a bit harder, but if it results in better results, I would say it's worth it.
Thank you very much. We have another question asking for the references you refer to regarding adductive reasoning. So if you could just add those to your PDF, I think that would be great.
Yeah.
I
was thinking about Timmermans and Tavori's work on abductive analysis, based on.
Next question. To what extent is positionality field specific versus experience and exposit dependent? I'm not quite sure if I've got that pronounced correctly. How readily do you find team members willing to push their professional boundaries to expand their thinking and collaboration? within and across fields.
Yeah, in different projects I've been in, I do see that some difficulties with the I can't pronounce the word also, so I don't know whether I fully get the question, but how I translate the question is that how do you collaborate with people who are pretty stubborn from their own field? How do you collaborate with a psychologist who turns everything into psychology, or a sociologist who turns everything into sociology? That is obviously really hard, and I don't envy the position of some of the team leaders who try to keep all these very stubborn people in. What I usually do is the fun stuff, so not the political stuff and not the where do we head to stuff, but more, hey, what do we see here? But then still, obviously, people come from different positionalities, different standpoints. There might be political, ideological standpoints that seep through, but also their field standpoints. And there's a lot of respect needed to do that properly,
Yes.
and celebration of each other's skills. But if you, as a dietitian or a sociologist, say, no, we can only explain the world in our way, then you don't get very far. And that's one of the things we try to do with panel. And if these stakeholders at the council have a very different position, but if they can agree on, but these are the issues, and we can actually first stack these different opinions and different views, different perspectives, and then we can talk on this, then at least there's a problem definition that is shared, even if you say, I don't really agree with it, but then you can still agree to disagree, but at least talk about it.
Right.
And
right.
it sounds easier than it is, obviously.
So I think we have time for one more question. How will your collaborative research contribute to the emerging scholars and novice researchers of the developing countries?
Yeah, and it's a very good question. And the Co-Create project is also continuing now in South Africa, so it's not just European anymore. And some of my colleagues, one of the colleagues who worked in Co-Create, Sharia Ayuandini, is now working much more towards participatory action research. But I fully see that also there's a world to win in the sense of doing it, but it's not so much. It's not unwillingness from my side, and it's not so much that there's no technical possibility, because these technical possibilities are there, and we could do it, but we need to establish all kinds of links and relations in a non-colonial fashion. So that's a tendency there still is. So I'm fully aware of that, yes. But I would love to. So see this as an invitation.
So no shortage of things to do, right?
Oh no, but that's, if you love your work, then there's never a shortage of things to do.
Absolutely.
And this is well, what I really like as a research project.
Well, I want to thank you very much for this excellent presentation. You can see from the chat that participants were thrilled with what you said and found it very helpful when they reflected on it in the context of their own work. We have a number of questions that we didn't get to, but I just want to let everyone know that we will copy off the chat and send it to Dr. Moerman, so that when he sends us the documents for posting, he can address the remaining questions. Any last words, Naringa?
Yes, of course. First of all, I would like to express my huge appreciation for your presentation. As per usual, very inspirational, and I can see how interactive we had the audience, and with the billions of questions and comments and reflections. I really, it got me think and give me more ideas and push to collaborate more. And hopefully we could collaborate one day together.
And in Canada too.
So let's do something together. And of course, I would like to take advantage and say a few words to the audience. Thank you so much for being here with us today. You are, as us, you are huge fans of qualitative research, and it's great, you know, to get inspired through Dr. Moerman's presentation. And keep in mind, if you would like to learn more about ATLAS.ti, we have a huge variety of free webinars. You can join us and learn about how to do a literature review with ATLAS.ti, how to do a teamwork with ATLAS.ti. So it's possible to learn totally for free all these fantastic tools ATLAS.ti offers and makes your life a little bit better. And finally, just I want to wish all of you best of luck in your qualitative research journeys. And thank you so much, Professor Karin, for guiding this session, and Dr. Moerman for sharing your knowledge with us and inspiring us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Neringa. And anyone can call me Gerben, of course, or Gerben, or any way you pronounce it.
Thank you. Thank you. It means a lot.
Okay, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Bye for now.
Thank you.